and thank you for inviting me to talk at this event today. I'm, as many of you know, leading an inquiry which we'll be reporting in 2019, not into civil society today, not into civil society yesterday, but what the future looks like. And I want to start by commending NAVCA for focusing on the future. We do live in incredibly uncertain, confusing, challenging, difficult times. We can overdo using those words. We live in really uncertain times. But I've always believed that when you want to look at the future, you don't get out a crystal ball. You pay exquisite attention to what's happening now. Because nearly always the changes we face are the ones we can see something of now. And you don't just pay exquisite attention to what's obviously happening. You look in the places that are overlooked, the places that are sometimes not heard, the more difficult and challenging places. And what I want to talk about is how paying exquisite attention, perhaps in surprising places, is where the strength of civil society will help us get through this terribly difficult time. Bob talked about doing Brexit. We've all been doing Brexit for several years now, haven't we? That's what powers what we do. And I'd agree with Bob's economic analysis. I think I'd go further. I think we are facing a really severe challenge. But I'll never talk about the economy without talking about the social crisis too. And the places that voted to leave are the places we need to listen to really carefully now. When I was at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we published some very powerful research quite soon after the referendum, and I'm no longer there, but I can quote research that was published while I was there. And what did we find? We found that people who voted leave were by and large poorer, older, and less well educated. That much I think we expected to find. But what we didn't, I foolishly didn't expect to find, is that those three characteristics were massively trumped by place. And however well paid you were and however well educated you were, there are places in England where you would live where you would probably still vote to leave. And that's because the feeling of your place matters so much. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of my inquiry is why I think place matters. But before I do that, I want to say a little bit about change. No voluntary organisation in this country, no community organisation, no charity has been formed except out of a desire for change and a response to crisis. I can't think of any reason why somebody would volunteer to sit in a tedious committee meeting every Wednesday in a dull community centre if they thought everything was just hunky-dory. If you think everything's fine, you don't use your energy, your time, your resource to join voluntary organisations, to create new organisations. And our history, I said I wouldn't look back, but our history is full of responses to crisis that have led to the creation of voluntary organisations. I wish I knew when this building was formed, but I bet you it came out of the changing face of London and the need to get education to young people here, because I know that across every city in the UK there are settlements, the 18th and 19th century, formed by churches, by universities, because they were so worried about the moral squalor and crisis, how people were living after the Industrial Revolution. Look at the post-war years, look at the feminist revolution and our response to women who were being beaten up at home. Look at every stage of crisis in our times. Look at the revolution we had in our sector with the AIDS and HIV epidemic, when gay and lesbian people organised their new, very disruptive voluntary organisations. You don't form voluntary organisations because the status quo is okay. So we should be really at our best and our most powerful at times of crisis and times of change, because that's when we always have grown, developed, and done things differently. And that's what encouraged me to join, or to take on the mantle of chairing this inquiry that was set up by 7 of the big foundations. And I don't think they really knew what they were going to get when I finally agreed to do it after a lot of talk, because what I said was this is going to have to be a different inquiry. It has to look to the future. It has to look outside, and it has to pay exquisite attention. It has to listen really carefully. And so we're doing a number of different things, some you'd expect. Of course, we've done a call for evidence. Of course, we got a really good response. Of course, I'm delighted. That's fantastic. Some of the most organised research institutes and charities in the country have all done good, nice, tidy responses. Delightful, fantastic. Of course, we are going to communities which are often overlooked, and working with Citizens UK, we've done 8 deep dives in localities. going to what many of the academics call below-the-radar organisations and networks, talking to people in very specific areas, recruiting community researchers to interview their neighbours, in effect, about what civil society means. And we are encouraging the conversations. The request that all of you, every CVS in the country, I challenged you when I launched this, to have a civil society future conversation. We've got the template. When we do it, I was in one in Newcastle only last week, people are buzzing. Because actually, people engaged in civil society know what they think. They've never been silent about that. And there is a real mood of engagement. And I would say a real desire to take back control. Because I think for too long, we as a sector have looked, I don't know if we look up or down to government, we've looked out to government and expected some answers. And I don't think that's the mood at all at the moment. When I launched this inquiry, I said we stand on the shoulders of giants. Nick Deakin did a most amazing report 18 years ago, knowing there was going to be a change of government, knowing there was quite a lot of money, talking about the architecture of the voluntary sector. We may come up with some recommendations like that, but my real guess is we are asking civil society to shape it. So I really urge those of you who haven't yet organised civil society conversations to do so. But what I said was that place matters, and I think infrastructure matters, and that's what I want to talk about briefly today. Place matters, and where people come from matters for a number of reasons. It's partly, as Big Local have recently informed me, and I didn't know this, 75% of us live no more than 15 miles away from where we were born. Now my guess is that's not true of many of you in this room, it's definitely not true of me, but actually that is one of the things we have to remember, is people feel very strongly about place. Healthy places are places where people come to and are welcomed, and are able to leave as well. And we all know around the country places where that is true, and places where people feel trapped or ashamed, or only safe when they're in their own place. So place matters to people, and it matters because we are facing a revolution in how we are managing our places. I started my working life in a CVS in the 70s, and we knew the job of the local authority, we knew our job, and it was very tidy. That's not what local leadership looks like now. Local leadership is shared, it's collaborative, it's dispersed. It's much more scary, but it could be much more productive. And I watch with interest and some enthusiasm how the more radical leaders of local authorities are rethinking completely the notion of the municipal leadership, the civic leadership. And it doesn't sit with people with big gold chains around them or CEO in their title. It's a much more dispersed thing. Third reason I think it matters is that people need somewhere to belong. People need something they belong to. And in the future we're looking at, which is already starting now, the place that most men at least felt they belonged up till 20 years ago was their place of work. And we know the next generation won't have that. Work doesn't give loyalty, it doesn't give affiliation, it doesn't give a sense of connection. But what does is the community you're part of and the place you're part of. So we have a really important challenge to respond to that. And the fourth and final reason I think place really matters is because place is where we experience the shocks of our modern interconnected society and where we recover from them. The overused term of resilience, I'm going to use again because I think we are at our best when we understand resilience. And it may be because I launched this inquiry in April and we had that horrific summer, terrorist bombing in Manchester, attacks in London, Grenfell Tower. You realise the shocks that we face in our society are responded to by one thing alone, and that's how people come together. The emergency services are fantastic, but it's people coming out, dishing out tea and pizza, giving people rides in their taxis. It's people fighting for justice and making sure that we heal those wounds. And just as we've responded to climate change in the north of England after the floods, getting ready for anything, the phrase York CVS, where I'm lucky enough to live, describes being ready for those shocks, seems to me to be a really important part of what we do in a place. And the second thing I think matters in terms of the future of civil society, and you lot, is that infrastructure matters. CVSs don't look now like they used to. They're not even called that anymore. But the notion that you hold together a place where people can convene and discuss the really difficult stuff is at the heart of what good local infrastructure does. Across the developed world, we are losing places for people to convene and come together. We're losing civic space. You give people places to discuss the really difficult stuff. And there is difficult stuff that divides us. Do we build more housing or do we protect the green belt? What do we do about young homeless people if they're living in your street and you don't like them being there? These are the battles of communities, which is only infrastructure organisations can bring together. Only you can manage the issue of how we deal with the disruptors in our sector, because the banks have got their disruptors and their incumbents. The retail sector has, my goodness, got its disruptors. Only look at what Amazon is doing to them. And the voluntary sector has new organisations forming all the time, out of crisis, out of anger, out of grief. You alone can make sure that as a sector we don't just put up the barriers to entry. So you don't look very much like us, so we'd rather you don't join. You alone are the organisations that can manage that big disruption that's happening. And I think you alone can manage the collaboration, which everybody will tell you we need. And I'm going to tell you, is more difficult than you can possibly imagine. It is not an accident that the word collaboration has within it the meaning of betrayal. Every time you collaborate, you betray your own organisation a bit. And a strong infrastructure enables you to do that thing, which is so important, so difficult, and so scary, but so important when we get it right. I think CVS's, and I'm going to be old-fashioned and call you that, the local infrastructure matters. And it matters because I think civil society really matters. It's not the third sector. It's the sector on which everything else is based. We'll have no return to inclusive growth unless we have active voluntary and community organisations. Growth will continue to be partial unless we're attending to the housing, to childcare, to the digitally excluded. That's what we do in our sector. We'll make no progress on behaviour change, which is the biggest challenge facing any government, unless voluntary and community organisations are at the forefront of that. And we'll make no progress towards living in more cohesive society unless we have really empowered voluntary and community organisations supported in their places. Thank you very much.